Hi, I'm Ryan Davis.
And I'm Kiernan Schmidt.
And this is Out of Office, a travel podcast.
The seat taken.
Hey, Kiernan.
Ryan, happy 2021.
It is 2020. It is legitimately 2021. We are recording this in 2021. It will come out in 2021. I'm still writing 2020 on all my checks, so I don't know about you, but
how many checks are Ryan? How old are you? My God, I forgot. Exclusively travelers checks.
I don't have any checks.
And do you have any resolutions? Any travel-related resolutions?
You know, my resolution is to get the COVID vaccine on the day it is available to me.
Did you see the news today? They're investigating cutting the Moderna doses in half so that they can double the supply.
It doesn't seem like that would speed things up in New York. We're just throwing doses away at the end of the day.
Did you hear about the pharmacist who just grabbed two people and was like, "Hey, I have to throw these out. Would you like them?"
I just got to stand outside of CVS and just hope somebody taps me on the shoulder.
Now, Ryan, we're ringing in the new year. We're doing one of our classic travel destination episodes, and this one is going to be about the great city, my great city that I live in, Boston. So, Ryan, now for what it's worth, in putting together the episode, much like how you had to break up Tennessee into a 47-part series, I had so much I want to say about Boston that this is going to be a one, maybe two, maybe 3-part episode, actually. So here's how I'm thinking we break it down. Today's episode is going to cover the, if you've never been here before, here are the big things that you need to hit. This is the standard tourist track, and we're going to talk about a few things that we've both done. We've done a couple of these together. And then next week will be the kind of, take two from a local, if you have a bit more time, here's some off the beaten track places I would recommend. And then I'm considering, I'm not committing, but I'm considering a part 3 that is specifically about a very special and underrated part of the city, which is the Boston Harbor Islands, which are overseen by the National Park Service.
Oh, I've never been to the Boston Harbor Islands.
You are super missing out. We've got some great, and full disclosure, by the way, I sit on the board of advisors of a nonprofit that works with the Parks Association to, yeah.
Whoa, folks.
Whoa. Listen, I feel it's only right if they're going to be touting it on the podcast. So I was thinking perhaps somebody from Boston Harbor Now, the nonprofit that I work with, could come on and talk to us about Spectacle Island and taking a cruise out. It's one of the great outdoor activities that you can do here in the great city of Boston.
Is that going to be sponsored content? Is it going to be brought to you by?
No, we are giving it as a donation to this wonderful nonprofit.
Yeah.
Plus, they work with the National Park Service. We are National Park Service heads here. And you, Mr. Hiker these days, we've got islands you can go and take a hike on.
I am looking forward to coming and taking a hike with you this spring. Maybe we can hit one of these trails. And
the joy is you get to take a boat. But anyway, let's save that for the potential Boston Part 3 Boston Harbor Islands episode.
Or Boston Part 4, Ryan and Kiernan live in Boston. Socially distanced.
I mean, the last time you were here, all we could do was stand 6 feet away from each other in masks and, pace Tufts University. So, Ryan, I think it's important now. These destination episodes, they tend to run long because we've got lots of opinions and places to cover. And by the way, you notice I say opinions, and that's because you and I have been dinged with a 2-star review on iTunes. They said we are not just informational, that we have opinions.
We do. We have opinions. And we often direct people to read books. That was one of our criticisms.
Right. They did not like that we think guidebooks and travel websites are good resources.
Yeah.
So that is a forewarning. We might have to put that right up front on every episode, incorporate that into the tagline. But for now, Ryan, I think it's time that we take off.
Can we just take the Amtrak to Boston? Cabin crew?
Flight attendants, prepare for takeoff, please.
All right, Ryan, we are on the Amtrak. We had to ding like in takeoff, but that's what we call it on Amtrak.
We're not in the quiet car. We're in the podcast. You can record a podcast in this car.
Some people don't understand that quiet car rule. Can I say, Catherine and I were actually just recently discussing things that we didn't expect to miss about traveling. And I will say, I really miss those like 4-hour, 3.5-hour Amtrak rides between Boston and New York. They're very productive, and it's quite a beautiful ride along the Connecticut shore.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, when I came back from my little trip to Boston a few weeks ago, there was 0 people on the train. It was like my own quiet car. And it was nice.
And if you're in an Isabella, you got those big windows.
Fantastic. I wasn't in an Isabella, Kiernan. I'm not.
Well, it's
a normal guy here.
I mean, it's called an Isabella. You didn't even pronounce it correctly. It's like people call it.
That's how we say it on the Eastern Shore.
Do you call it espresso?
Do actually.
No, you know that it's espresso, right?
Espresso. I do. It's a regionalism, Kiernan. Are there any regionalisms in Boston?
No, it's a stupidism. So now, Ryan, you have spent a fair amount of time in Boston. Is that fair to say?
I have, yeah. I've been up to Boston quite a bit in my life.
And tell me, what are your broad perceptions about this great city?
It is. In the way that Tennessee is about the Civil War, Boston is about the Revolutionary War.
That's
everywhere you go, it's like, and this is where Ben Franklin, sat for 15 minutes. It's like a monument to that occasion.
Right. And it's a weird, Ben Franklin really more of a Philadelphia guy, but he made his way up here, and he
was there occasionally.
He was from here. He was born here, and actually, we're going to talk about the graveyard that has a big Franklin grave in it that people often mistake for Ben Franklin. It's actually his parents' grave.
But he's buried in Philadelphia, right?
He's got to be buried in Philadelphia,
He's got to be buried,
right?
Yeah.
All right, now we got to look at it, Ben Franklin. Well, I mean, if you throw stuff like that out. Yes, he is born in Christ Church Burial Ground, Philadelphia, PA. But Ryan, this is not
born there.
No,
that's what you just said. He was born in Christ.
Oh, did I say that? Oh, God, well, from cradle to grave.
Yeah.
Now, Ryan, you're right. Historical landmarks and walking tours, that's definitely a big part of visiting Boston. Red brick, very good. So you've got
the Red Sox.
The Red Sox. I mean, it's like you're doing this episode.
Ben and Matt.
Ben and Matt. Who are those?
Ben Affleck and Matt Damon?
Oh, brother. They've gone Hollywood. They're not true Boston anymore.
Please. He still lives down on the quad or,
So Ryan, here's how I think we're going to break it up today. So as I said, this is going to be kind of the must-see list. And some of these places I think you'll be familiar with. Some I think you'll have heard of and not done. And then some I think might be discoveries even to you. So I'm going to talk a couple of historic walks. And walking, Boston is an incredibly walkable city. It's not a huge, sprawling metropolis. You can really cover off most of the great historical monuments that you want to visit in just a long weekend.
Yeah, no, it's a place where everybody knows your name.
I mean, sadly, there is like the bar that Cheers is based on, right? On Boston Common.
Yes.
And that is a real tourist trap and will not be making my list. And so we're going to cover a couple walks that I recommend. And that's going to really lead us through some of the big historical landmarks that you definitely want to hit, including several that we've visited together, Ryan. And I've also got some neighborhoods that I would recommend that you take time to check out, even just to grab a meal or to explore by foot, just wandering around the neighborhood, stopping in shops, should COVID allow it. And then finally, I'd like to wrap up with a couple cultural institutions. So these are kind of the great museums that we have here, the Symphony Hall, and of course, no visit to Boston would be complete if you don't visit Fenway Park, the home of the Red Sox.
I thought you were going to say Club Cafe.
I don't know what Club Cafe is.
That's the gay bar I go to all the time downtown. No visit's been complete.
Now, Ryan, have you ever heard of the Freedom Trail?
Yes, I have.
So the Freedom Trail is really like a Boston calling card. This is a 2.5 mile long path. And, that's really very walkable for most people. And it is, it sounds like you could cover that ground quickly, but there are 16 historical stops along the Freedom Trail. And many people will take a guided tour of this. You'll often see kind of the hacky tour guides in costume with a three-corner hat. and they're speaking in some sort of faux British accent that it's unclear why the colonists would have had that if they had been here for several generations. But I would recommend that you take the time to read about the destinations of the 16 and set aside a longer period of time to actually sit with, wander, and explore a few of those sites more in depth. And I'll share with you the ones that I would most recommend. So of the 16 stops, we're not going to go one by one. That would tip us into 4 episodes, which I know Ryan wouldn't allow. But you're going to cover off most of the blockbusters. So you got Boston Common, you got a couple big burial grounds, you have a couple old churches, and Revolutionary War sites like what Ryan was talking about before. And the one of the quintessential places and it's where the Freedom Trail kicks off, is Boston Common.
So Boston Common is one of the oldest city parks in the United States.
That's absolutely right, and it's expansive. It's quite big, and it's on a quite a steep incline, so you can get quite a workout. It's not very level, and you have playgrounds and a lot of broad lawns. There are commemorative plaques of when the Pope has given mass there.
Right.
Boston Common is one of the places that is most associated with the city of Boston. And my favorite piece of it is actually adjacent. It's just across a main thoroughfare in Boston called the Boston Public Garden. Now, are you familiar with that area?
I have walked by it before when I've been exploring the Commons, but I haven't actually been there.
So this is a much more, as you would guess from the word common to public garden, it's a much more curated botanical garden experience. And it's actually the first public botanical garden in the United States. You get a lot of historical firsts in Boston.
Is it ticketed?
Oh, no. This is completely open to the public.
Okay,
I mean,
cool.
it's a public park.
So it's not like the New York Botanical Garden. You can just literally as you're in the Commons, just walk over and explore it without.
That's exactly right.
That's cool.
And it has plants that date back to 1837.
Really?
Yes. So.
Wow.
Yeah. So if you like old plants, Boston
and who doesn't?
Public Garden is for you. And it also has the iconic swan boats that people associate it with the city. That's again, it's kind of a tourist trap, but it's also a rite of passage when you visit Boston. It's like a pond
there you can sort of go through with the boats.
It's this lovely little lagoon, and it has this bridge that stretches across it. And in nicer weather, you go on a swan boat, you spend some nice time under giant trees and people on park benches, and it's all very bucolic and lovely.
It sounds just what John Adams did when he would visit. He loved the swan boats.
I don't know that he made it in from the farm too often to the Common, but there's also another icon of the city right in the public garden. There's a famous children's book called Make Way for Ducklings by Robert McCluskey. Are you familiar with it?
I am not, no.
So this is a lovely illustrated book about a family of ducks that make their way from the Charles River to the lagoon that the swan boats traverse in the public gardens. And this family of ducks, a mother duck with a series of ducklings behind, have become a real favorite icon of the city, have become a real favorite symbol of the city. And they've actually put in statues in the public garden of the ducks. And there are groups that decorate them in little costumes. So you might have them dressed up in Halloween. They might be in Red Sox gear. And it's always fun to take your kid, read to your kid the book, or maybe you read the book as a child. Go and visit the ducklings when you come to Boston.
Have you read Little Baby Charlie, the book yet?
Absolutely. And, Charlie, now Toddler Charlie.
Yeah.
Toddler Charlie is very familiar with the book. And but we have not visited the ducklings. That would be a great COVID-friendly activity.
Yeah, well, he didn't really make out the elephant statue yet, so maybe you got to give him a little more time.
Yeah, it's a pretty obscure reference for folks who want to go back to the episode where we discussed visiting Tufts University and the elephant statue.
A lot of elephants.
Listen, we're saving Tufts for part 2.
Fair.
But it's always fun to see what creative people have gotten up to with costuming the duckling statues. And if I had to guess,
little masks.
I would think they must have little duck masks. And in fact, we'll post some photos, some favorite costume photos of the ducklings up on the old Instagram, which is at OOO podcast or at Ooh podcast. Like when you're impressed with a podcast, you say Ooh podcast. But there's also another statue within the public garden that I want to call out because I think it is so funny and interesting, which is, Boston is a city that is really renowned for its great hospitals, medical facilities, biochemical companies, and they really it's a center for medicine globally.
And hopefully you won't get to experience this when you visit Boston.
Well,
unless you're there for
a lot of people travel for that express purpose. True. In which case, if you need to get out of the hospital, go take a walk around the public gardens.
Yeah.
And there is this monument, one of these, giant plinths with a statue on top and a little fountain around it that you might just walk past and not acknowledge. But it has a great story behind it, and it's called the Ether Monument. It's also known as the Good Samaritan. And this is a statue and fountain. It's in the northwest corner of the public garden. And what it commemorates is the use of ether as anesthesia.
Well, anyone who's seen Gone with the Wind is, and seen what they did before they had ether. That is brutal.
I got to tell you, Ryan, never seen Gone with the Wind.
What?
No, I've never seen Gone with the Wind. And I believe it's been canceled.
It's been canceled. I'll never see it. Yeah.
No.
On HBO, you have to sign, you have to click through a trigger warning to watch it. So,
now, what are you referring to in Gone with the Wind?
When, numerous scenes where we see Civil War hospitals and, people are getting their legs amputated awake, just taking a sip of whiskey and biting down on a bullet, piece of wood.
Right? Yeah. Oh, brutal.
Yeah. They didn't even have bullets then. They were just stuck with, whatever.
They were chomping on other amputated legs just so that they didn't bite their tongue off.
Yeah. Well, and then ether must have been a huge,
ether was a huge breakthrough, and when you know that's what the monument is for, you look closely at it, and it shows patients who are in pain getting a rag of ether from a Good Samaritan. And there is a plaque that says, to commemorate that the inhaling of ether causes insensibility to pain, first proved to the world at the Mass General Hospital in Boston. Right. And so this is, I was actually turned on to this monument by my surgeon father-in-law, and made a point to go down to the public garden and had walked past this statue many, many times and finally took in the wonderful history behind it.
That is fascinating. I wonder if in front of Purdue Pharmaceuticals they have just
buckets of addictive pills. So anyway, I encourage you to start out the Freedom Trail.
And pour a little alcohol and just kind of breathe it in just to give yourself sort of that,
definitely a little
really
a little rag of ether. Just a tiny scent can make all the difference in a walking tour. Now, Ryan, there's a couple other places on the Freedom Trail I'd like to call out. So we've talked about Boston Common and making time for the public garden. There's also just around the corner what is called the Granary burying ground. And
I love this burying ground because it's got the most ridiculous tombstone for John Hancock.
That's exactly right. Yeah. Yes.
It is this, folks, it is just ludicrously phallic. It is just this, however,
when that comes from Ryan Davis, you know that comes from a vast history of evaluating phallic things.
Exactly. Who is this guy, though? He signs his name just massive on the Declaration.
Well, you can't spell Hancock without cock. So
and then he, feels the need to have the biggest statue in the graveyard.
It's true. So he's got the big signature, and he clearly, he's a man of wealth, and he put a lot of it into a very impressive and large tombstone. And you can also see the the gravestones of lots of other legendary figures there. Paul Revere is there. Sam Adams is there.
Oof. And a lot of drinking went on in that.
And this is also where you get the Franklin obelisk, which is actually the Franklin parents. But it's also one of these charming old graveyards where you can see the classic iconography of old Yankee gravestones, like the hourglass or like a skull with wings on it. That's when they really knew how to do gravestones.
Crosses.
Yeah, crosses. Sure.
You see some
yes.
crosses.
Yeah, obviously you see some crosses. So you visit the Common. Definitely make time for the Granary burying ground. Makes for a great Instagram at that Hancock grave, and you can comment on its size. Then I would recommend stopping by the Old State House. And this is today a museum. Some of these places are ticketed and require a small ticket price. They have a small collection of memorabilia and Americana. You know, you have some weaponry from the Revolution. Really puts you in the mindset of old Boston. And Ryan, you and I also visited the next few sites together. So along the Freedom Trail is the Paul Revere House, and this is the home of Paul Revere.
Yeah, and one of the things I love about it is how it when you, if you were to drop in the middle of it, Kiernan, you would immediately be able to say, wait, this has to be Paul Revere's house. So the specificity of the house.
Yeah. So what Ryan is alluding to is multi-layered here. So let me peel it apart for folks. The first is you're referring to my rule for what makes a great historic house, which is can I be dropped in blindfolded, have the blindfold removed, and within a few moments look around the room that I'm in and make an educated guess as to whose house it is. So the quintessential example of this is Sagamore Hill. If you dropped me into Theodore Roosevelt's house, I would turn around. You know, you got the Rough Rider hat, you got the sword, and many different pieces of taxidermied animals about clearly Theodore Roosevelt's house. Now, we have been on record in previous episodes, Paul Revere House, not that impressive.
No, not as like, because Paul Revere as a person is such like a, you know, he's such a blurry character. You know, we don't know like a ton about him that's beyond like the fact he was, he was Paul Revere and he did this. He
worked in silver.
He worked in silver. Yeah.
Yeah. Anyone who's read Johnny Tremaine knows that.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, most of what we know from Paul Revere, we know from the poem.
But I think we would both say if you're tight on time, you don't need to make time for the Paul Revere house. Maybe walk around the exterior. If you want to give a couple bucks, I'm happy somebody's looking after it. I don't want it to go away, but I wouldn't say it's a must see.
It's also not a huge. It's not like you're visiting the Vanderbilt Mansion or something, right? You're in and out in 15 minutes.
That's true. Yeah, it's a handful,
3 rooms,
handful of rooms. A couple pieces of furniture. I think it had a nice hearth. He didn't
have a decadent lifestyle. Although I bet that real estate in Boston now, I bet that's
it would go pretty well. You're right about that. However, part of the Paul Revere story is another stop on the Freedom Trail, and that is the Old North Church, where famously they hung lanterns. 1 if by land, 2 if by sea. That's the Old North Church, and you can go in and visit. It's super fascinating, very well preserved, small, very old church.
Is this the church where they had all the little compartments for people to sit? That is I have never seen anything like that before. That church, very interesting interior.
That's right. So it's not all long pews facing in one way. It's actually very compartmentalized and different.
It's like
families.
Going to church in a cubicle. That's essentially. It's like church cubicle. Yeah,
a church cubicle. It's like you want to make church worse, add cubicles.
It was like ready for COVID. Was it built during some sort of outbreak? Allow your family pod to be in this little. Yeah.
But I definitely think the Old North Church is worth a visit. Again, not a place that takes a ton of time, but it is very evocative of the period, and you get to learn about some of the prominent families that nominally owned or sponsored these little cubicles that you're referring to. And as you say, it's very distinctive. I haven't seen many churches that look that way, so it's well worth being able to see where this historic lantern hanging happened. A further place that you will see on the Freedom Trail, and this is just outside in nature, is the site of the Boston Massacre. So, Ryan, this was the Boston Massacre site. This is a place where there was a deadly riot on March 5th of 1770. And there was a bit of a brawl, a run-in, and finally a killing between British soldiers and the local colonials, who were, of course, this was the lead-in to the American Revolution.
Because Boston was an occupied city.
That, of course. I mean, to say occupied, I mean, they were a colony of the crown, but things like the Stamp Act and the Townshend Acts had anti-Britain fervor in the air, and the communities were split between royalists and colonials. And I have to say, I did like the accent from England. So I'm not saying this went the wrong way, but it'd be nice to still have some tea and biscuits.
Yeah, well, I mean, what accent do you all have in Boston now? It's very strange.
I mean, there are pockets of that accent, but I'm not going to do it, nor do I have it.
No.
And Ryan, of course, famously, I know John Adams really became quite famous for the fact that he defended the British soldiers for having shot into the riotous crowd. That speaks to how much he believed that everybody deserved representation in law.
It did not make him that popular at the time.
Well, he was never very popular.
No, he wasn't.
All right, Ryan, there are two more places that you would hit on the Freedom Trail. The first is the USS Constitution, also known as Old Ironsides, which is this great tall ship. It has 3 huge masts. And you and I actually visited it together, let's see, about a year and a half ago.
Yeah, it's quite the ship.
And it is actually the world's oldest commissioned naval vessel that is still afloat. It was launched in 1797. And its name was chosen from a list that was presented to nobody else but George Washington. That's how old the USS Constitution is, though I kind of like the Old Ironsides.
Yeah, and they went with Constitution. They had like 5 words they could pick from. They were like, well we don't want to call it the Independence. We could call it the Declaration.
The Eagle. Yeah.
The Washington? No, we're going to use that one.
Actually, it'd be interesting to dig up what the other 10 names are. I'm sure
They were
you
all
just
better.
listed off a bunch. You have to think the Washington was probably on it.
Yeah. He's like, I just can't with another one of those.
And of course, Old Ironsides refers to the fact that this ship famously had incredible, strong lumber siding that could stand up to cannonballs, as proven by the fact that it continues to stay at sea today. Its most notable actions were in the War of 1812 against the United Kingdom. So we moved from the Revolution to the War of 1812. So
It survived longer than most things. That's like 15 years later.
Yeah, absolutely. And the Constitution was retired from active service in 1881, but it was designated as a museum in 1907, and it still continues that tradition today, well over 100 years.
But it went on like a 20-year tour. A 90-port tour.
It went on a 3-year 90-port tour.
Oh, yeah. It went on a 3-year 90-port tour. That's wild.
Yeah, so they'll still bring it out from time to time. But
that was in the 30s.
You have to be careful. And I remember when we visited, very good upkeep on it. I mean, it definitely feels like some of these planks have been replaced, gets a nice coat of paint. Every once in a while has some
good... A ton of tanks. I mean, really impressive amount of tanks. You can only imagine when you're down in the hall of it, how loud it must have been down there.
Absolutely. Now, when you say tanks, do you mean cannons? Is that what you're referring to? The cannons are very impressive. You get to experience the cannons heading out the side. And I remember too, Ryan, you get a real sense of how much shorter the seamen were at the time, because you and I both had to duck. And so we moved from John Hancock's Falk grave all the way to the seamen at the USS Constitution.
And it's very short. The hall is, you have to really kind of crouch, and it took like 3 or 4 men to operate one of those cannons. I mean, it was crowded down there.
You mean the tanks?
One of the tanks.
Yeah.
Tanks have cannons on them.
And the Constitution, before you visit, you get to browse a great museum and a couple exhibits there before you go out onto the ship on a guided tour. Definitely would recommend this. It's very atmospheric. They have very smart guides, especially anyone interested in maritime history, military history. And it's just a beautiful old ship. It's lovely to spend time and remind yourself that, Boston is a great famous city because it was built on Boston Harbor. And the final place that you're going to hit on the Freedom Trail is the Bunker Hill Monument. And this is a great memorial that stands in Charlestown. It commemorates the Battle of Bunker Hill, which took place on June 17th, 1775. And this is where New England soldiers faced down the British Army for the first time in proper battle.
I don't think I've ever been to this.
So you can see this memorial from the USS Constitution when you get back on land, and it is a quite pleasant walk up Bunker Hill, and you can go up there and appreciate. Remind yourself, especially for Americans, it can make your heart grow to remember those who won independence and freedom for us, and rid us of the tyranny of those dirty British. I take it back what I said about the accent. Now that we're at Bunker Hill, I remember. Down with royalty. I may watch The Crown, but I'm glad we're not under her technically. And Ryan, the last notable thing that I would say, besides the wonderful view that you get from the Bunker Hill Monument back on the environs, is the cornerstone was actually laid by none other than the Marquis de Lafayette.
We love the Marquis de Lafayette.
The famous tour where he returned back to the United States,
right.
A beloved figure. He laid the cornerstone, and so you get a little taste of Hamilton when you visit the Bunker Hill Monument. All right. Now, continuing on, Ryan, I want to point out, and we will put a link to this as well as everything else in the show notes, another walking tour that I could not stress enough to you that you should add this into any itinerary that you do in Boston. And this is a trail that is curated by the National Park Service, and it's called the Black Heritage Trail on Beacon Hill. Now, Beacon Hill is a famous neighborhood in Boston. It abuts Boston Common. It's a lot of famous old 19th century architecture, and they still have, cobblestones in parts of it, and that red brick that you were mentioning as iconic to Boston. It's home to many very wealthy people, including none other than John Kerry. Maybe you've heard of him.
Wow. Yeah, I have.
And so it's extremely atmospheric, really takes you back to a certain time in Boston. But there is an underappreciated story in this neighborhood. And that is in the heart of Boston, the story of the Black community that escaped from slavery, took root here, and fought against the fugitive slave hunters, where the Black community came together in churches and schools and created an outpost of freedom here in the North. And it is also deeply entwined in the story of the Underground Railroad. Several of the houses that you'll see on this tour were stops on the Underground Railroad where escaped slaves knew that if they got there, it was a place of safety. And so the National Park Service does a great job of leading walking tours here, but they also have the Black Heritage Trail tour that you can print out and walk through yourself. And it's very well labeled on the buildings themselves as you walk through Bunker Hill. So you can get a little dose of that Boston Brahmin side of things, but also this important, Boston has a very checkered past when it comes to...
Really?
Yes. And there's the famous history of busing that I think people often think of with Boston. I think we are making strides. Boston has a very progressive mayor here, Mayor Walsh, which, by the way, if you haven't seen the documentary City Hall, highly recommend. You appreciate how we're making steps forward. But this Black Heritage Trail will really tell you a piece of Boston history you probably don't know. And it kicks off in one notable place that I want to mention, which is if you are looking at the Boston State House, which is right on Boston Common, famous for its big golden dome. That's how you'll know the building. And it looks like a state house, and you could appreciate a great statue of JFK that they have outside. Just outside of it, in Boston
Also
Common,
from Boston.
Yeah, also from Boston. Absolutely. Well, I mean, absolutely. That's why I have that famous Kennedy accent. There is a memorial which is where the Black Heritage walking tour kicks off, called the Robert Gould Shaw and Massachusetts 54th Regiment Memorial. And this is a memorial and a plaque and a series of names that commemorates one of the first Black regiments to serve in the Civil War. So Ryan, you said we were only Revolutionary War. I've already hit on Revolutionary War, War of 1812, and now Civil War. And
folks should know that this is the same character that Matthew Broderick portrayed in the film Glory.
Yes, that's correct. I haven't seen Gone with the Wind. I also haven't seen Glory.
You've never seen Glory? I just rewatched. I watched it over quarantine, so I've watched it in the last year.
Oh,
and
really?
It holds up. It's a little problematic, as you can imagine, because the entire film about the first Black regiment, or this early Black regiment, is told through Matthew Broderick's eyes for some reason.
Yeah.
But there's still a lot of good stuff in it. But you could cut out a lot of, Matthew Broderick's sort of personal drama and not lose much in the film.
That might be your big YouTube debut. You should do a re-edit where you take out Matthew Broderick.
Nobody would complain.
And while we're talking about neighborhoods, I've spotlighted Beacon Hill here. I would also say well worth a walk over to the North End, which is the famous Italian neighborhood. Lots of great bakeries, great pasta shops. It's a neighborhood that has lots of small specialty grocery stores, and you can definitely pick up some good souvenirs, some food items to bring back with you. And it's just a very charming neighborhood.
Yeah, I have memories of doing some little shopping with you there, Kiernan, quite a few years ago.
That's right. And it's very close to, again, a highly walkable city. The Freedom Trail area, the Beacon Hill, none of these neighborhoods are terribly far from each other. So definitely take time to go and visit it. And I should also mention, as far as shopping goes, you will visit Faneuil Hall on the Freedom Trail. That's important. Today it's a little bit of a overly commercialized shopping center, but there's important history there. It was the major meeting house of historic Boston. So it's well worth there. There's a couple good exhibitions there about the history of it. I would recommend checking those out, but then maybe you don't have to spend time in the Uniqlo store. Keep going on the Freedom Trail. Now, Ryan, I also want to move on to the cultural institutions that we're going to talk about. The first that I would really recommend you make time for is the Museum of Fine Arts here in Boston. Have you been to this museum?
I have been to it. Yeah, it's great.
Yeah, it's one of America's great art museums. It has over 500,000 pieces. It dates from the ancient art all the way through contemporary. It's got a global collection. And particularly, I'm a big fan of the American wing that they have there. As you would guess, in Boston, they have a lot of great arts and crafts work. They have historic silver. They have paintings from great American artists through the ages. They have lecterns from historic churches. And so it's just extremely evocative. And one thing that I really like about the design, well, they do have a great Christmas tree. I would be remiss if I didn't mention, if you happen to be in Boston around Christmas, they have a soaring Christmas tree that they line with all the flags of the world. Almost like tinsel, and I find that very charming. I've always liked that Christmas tree. They also have a right in the center of the museum, there's a courtyard that is enclosed with a roof, but is a big open area. And they have in that courtyard a quite good restaurant and a massive column by the glass artist Dale Chihuly. I'm sure you're familiar with his art, Ryan.
Oh, yes, I am.
Yeah, I think he's a little overrated at this point, too, which I can hear in your voice.
When we were in Nashville, we went to one of these estates, and they had like an exhibition of his all over the garden.
Yeah.
And so everywhere, it was like this beautiful garden with, for whatever reason, just weird glasswork.
Spiky blown glass. Yeah. I mean, I think Dale Chihuly is like good in small doses. This column is quite impressive. It's huge and like neon green.
He suffered, he was in a car accident and was deeply damaged by the glass when he was a young man.
He's only got one eye.
Yeah.
I understand.
So he took control of the glass after that.
So what's that mean? What are the disasters in our lives we're going to take control of? You're going to have to take control of cigarettes.
If I could turn anything into a business like he did, I would. He makes Jeff Koons look like he works hard.
And there's a very good Roman and Greek collection that I would recommend you check out, and really keep your eye out for great special exhibitions. And they have a huge special exhibition space below ground, below that major courtyard. So that's going to be the place where you check out most of the landmark shows that they put on. And not far from the Museum of Fine Arts is an extraordinary museum called the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum.
This place is awesome.
I have to say, if I had to send you to one museum, I would send you to the Gardner Museum before the Museum of Fine Arts.
It's certainly it's like a unique experience.
Exactly.
It's a very cool space.
Much more experiential. It's a 1901 mansion that, as you would guess from the name, was owned by Isabella Stewart Gardner. She was an art collector with extremely particular and eclectic tastes. She collected European art, Asian art, American, fine and decorative arts. The mansion tries to manifest her tastes all around you. And it is also, as a building, extremely interesting. It looks like a Venetian plaza. And when you go inside, there's a courtyard that rings a quite beautiful garden that is constantly changing. They always have statuary in it. And that's the joy of the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum is simply wandering through it. Unlike at the Met or the Museum of Fine Arts, where you are looking at very curated, framed, pristine displays of artworks. The Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum feels like a collection, and the rooms are meant to be experienced together, how pieces speak to one another and enhance the whole experience. And I think it really gives you some insight into Isabella Stewart Gardner.
Yeah, and it is absolutely one of those places that you can't imagine not in the location that it's at, right? So it is so part of the space.
Yes,
and there's really other cool. There's a lot of like the middle of it sort of reminds me of the cloisters in New York.
Yes, I understand.
With those fantastic garden. I mean, this is a very Instagrammable place. Yes. I mean, to say she didn't know about Instagram, but she designed a place that's really got a lot of Instagram opportunities. And then we've talked before about the famous art heist.
Yeah, it's exactly right. Yes. Yeah. So I've recommended in a Last Stop previously a podcast called Last Scene. And this is the story of 13 artworks that were stolen from the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum. And the quest to find them, they remain lost. And in the museum, they still have empty frames in the places where they were stolen. It was a classic heist, and they still to this day have not solved it.
Yeah, so it is a cool place to go. There's really cool art and just the story. I mean, there's endless stories in that museum. So couldn't recommend it more.
Two more pieces of tips that I would give you on the Gardner Museum. The first is that you can get a couple good discounts on admission. The first is if you wear a piece of Red Sox gear, you get a couple dollars off your admission.
You have to humiliate yourself, though.
If your name is Isabella, Ryan, like you know anything about baseball. If your name
by wearing baseball outfit, that's what I meant.
If your name is a baseball outfit. If your name is Isabella, you get in for free, and if you visit on your birthday, you get in for free.
There you go.
I also think they're quite renowned for their weekly chamber music concerts, which of course you can't experience right now, but post-pandemic, make time. This is a great way to see the museum. Make time to go experience chamber music in this extremely evocative space. And while we're talking about music, another great cultural institution of Boston that you should make time for, especially if you're here for a few days and you can get a ticket to a concert, is Symphony Hall. Boston Symphony Hall is one of the premier concert halls all across the world. It is considered one of the absolute top venues for classical music. And musicians and artists say that the acoustics of the Boston Symphony Hall are nearly perfect. There was a scientist named Wallace Sabine who developed a mathematical formula to predict the reverberation of sounds in the space and then constructed the building to optimize the listener experience.
I've never seen a concert there, but it sounds incredible.
Yeah, and it would strike you as a very particular and intimate music space. I mean, it's big, but the walls, ceilings, and floor all slope towards the audience, and the seats are exactly 5 inches apart because that's what was considered to be optimal to experience this music. And I've been to several concerts at Symphony Hall. Always a delightful experience, even if you're not a classical music lover. Well worth experiencing the ambiance of the building itself. And I believe that this is a place that could actually spark your love for classical music. Perhaps you will discover a new passion.
And I want to link in the show notes to this viral video from a couple years ago at Symphony Hall, where this child said "wow" after a clip ended. Yeah. After a clip ended, oh gosh, after a piece ended, and it was totally quiet, and the kid said "wow," and then the audience, it was a lovely little moment.
That's because he appreciated the nearly perfect acoustics.
I'm sure it must have sounded incredible. So we all should be able to say "wow."
And Ryan, now that you've gotten us talking about baseball outfits.
Oh gosh.
I can't recommend enough probably one of the most obvious things you should be doing, but I would say it is essential Boston visiting is taking in a Red Sox game, or if you're visiting in the off season, go take a tour of Fenway Park. Fenway is actually the oldest active ballpark in Major League Baseball. And it is its footprint is very distinctive. It's a very tight stadium. So it has a constrained location. It abuts a major highway. And because of its small footprint, it has lots of quirky features that you can experience on the regular tours that they give, the behind-the-scenes tours that they give. Particularly famous is, of course, the Green Monster in left field. And it's great joy if you can get tickets. You can actually sit up on the Green Monster and experience a game from there.
And is this minor league ball or?
I mean, is that a joke? That's such a weird joke.
Sorry, no, I know. You guys won the World Series a couple years back.
I mean, I wouldn't say I had anything to do with it, but Ryan, there are probably sportsmen who listen to this podcast.
Yes, I am sure.
We can't reveal
high correlation between out of office listeners and sports affinity.
Well, Ryan, we know they're not all Broadway fans, so
That's true.
We shouldn't be pretending that we're totally sports illiterate. But go and get a Fenway Frank. Put on your best Red Sox gear. Even if you're not a great Red Sox fan, adopt Boston as your home city for the day, because it really is a great joy to go sing Sweet Caroline with the crowd and take in a Red Sox game.
Well, I think that is, you make me want to take me out to the ballpark.
It's take me out to the ball game, Ryan. So that just goes to show how many games you've been to. But I agree. I think that's where we should wrap it up for Boston Part 1. These are if you came here, you did all of those stops, I think you've gotten a really good taste of the city. And next time we'll be discovering kind of that next tier. We've got museums, we've got historic universities, places that I deeply love and connect with. This is kind of the next episode will be really my personal Boston checklist after you've done these many great historic sites that everybody knows.
Well, I think that is going to be a great episode. I've got a few Boston favorites I might sprinkle in as well, Kiernan.
We'll see if I allow it. I do control the editing here. Now, Ryan, with that, I would say it's time for the last stop.
The last stop.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is the last stop on this train. Everyone, please leave the train.
No, Ryan, we are here in the last stop. This is the last segment of the show, the final segment of the show. We have a 3-segment structure most weeks, and this is that one that brings us home. And it's where we take a moment. It's a bit more contemplative than the other segments we have, where you and I each take a moment. We sort of center ourselves and we share one thing, just one. If you bring others, it's too many. It clutters up this last stop. We want it to be quick, to the point, much like this description itself. And it's where we share one thing that maybe something we read, something we bought, anything that fed the spirit of wanderlust within us, even during the workday week. So, Ryan, I'm wondering, do you have a tip? Do you have a piece of gear? Do you have an experience? Do you have something that you could share this week? One thing that is your last stop.
I think while folks are waiting to get to Boston, they should watch the John Adams HBO series from 2008 with Paul Giamatti as John Adams.
Fantastic.
Yeah, it's absolutely fantastic, and so much of it takes place in Boston, and you'll see, these places that we were talking about in action on the screen, and I think would be a great way to sort of refresh before somebody, went on that Freedom Tour.
And this was based on the David McCullough biography. Many people pick that up and after watching the series. Yeah. It's like how Hamilton makes you want to go read the Chernow biography. I see it right behind you here on the in your podcasting studio.
Thank you.
And it doesn't look like the binding's been broken too much.
No, I haven't.
But it's a lovely
it's a
conversation piece. Yeah. Similarly, that biography is masterful. And I think that it can really inform, if you read it on your maybe on the Amtrak on your way to Boston, you will be able to appreciate the Revolutionary history all the richer.
Yeah, but both those are great recommendations. Absolutely.
And I don't want to give too much of a preview, but next week we will be talking about visiting the Adams home. Which is a park site that you can go and visit even today, but it's a little outside of Boston, which is why I didn't include it on today's episode.
And I have never been to this, and it's high on my list to go to.
Absolutely. That is a must-do. When you come up post-pandemic, that will be our number one destination.
I'm excited. Maybe we can do another live episode from John Adams', house. Do you have a last stop, Kiernan?
No, Ryan, because you gave us a Boston specific last stop, I'm gonna give one too. And so for those who are visiting, I hope that you listen this far, which is when you're on Boston Common, if you look up at the State House, most people focus on the massive golden dome because that's the most eye-catching piece. But if you look all the way at the top of the dome, there is something, this gilded little nub up there, and many people mistake it for a pineapple. You remember?
Wait, is that not a bust of Charlie Baker? It's just not just like a Charlie Baker's head.
That would be really creepy. Charlie Baker's head on a spike on top of the dome. That's really, most people make the mistake of thinking it's a pineapple, which is like we discussed in the Charleston episode, is a symbol of welcome. What it actually is a gilded wooden pine cone. And this is because of in early Massachusetts history, the lumber industry was incredibly important to the colonists. And so as an acknowledgement of this history and this industry that contributed to the building of Massachusetts, this pine cone was put atop the State House so that we wouldn't forget that history. And Boston in general is a city that rewards you if you remember to look up. There's lots of different weather vanes. There's lots of interesting stories behind those sort of architectural toppers that often tell an interesting, compelling historical story, like this history of the lumber industry in Boston, which I don't think you'd commonly think of us.
No, I wouldn't. That is... Yeah,
it's those magical tidbits that keep bringing you back to out of
people
office.
Listen. Yeah.
So
you would have missed that pine cone if Kiernan hadn't flagged it. Why did they dip it in gold?
Well, you got to preserve it. You just throw it up there. You know, it's gonna
so
wither.
Do we think it's actually preserved underneath, or do we think it's just rotted to the core now?
Oh, I think I'll have to confirm this. Perhaps this will be worthy of a recalculating. This is a sculpted pine cone that was then gilded. This is not a pine cone that they just picked up off the ground. And
it's not like a gilded pine cone, like literally like something Donald Trump would do.
Listen, I'll get back to you, but no, I don't think so.
Okay, good to know. Until next time, I'm Ryan Davis.
And I'm Kiernan Schmidt.
And this is Out of Office, a travel podcast.
This seat taken.
Will you do an episode that's just Kiernan Schmidt's Cambridge, where you can just tell us all the various,
I'm going to include Cambridge in the next one. Cambridge and Somerville, we're coming.
All the moments, we can see all the magical places of Kiernan's personal history. Your first kiss, the Harvard Plaza.
It's called Harvard Square.
Oh, yeah.
Plaza.